Happy Friday, Packers fans. Welcome into an all-new episode of the Pack-A-Day Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. As always, you can find the podcast at Pack-A-Day Podcast. Thanks so much for being here. It is Friday. Should be a fun episode today. We're sort of closing up shop on our free agent series. Try to go as meticulously as possible through this, kind of going over some big name free agents that Green Bay could sign, and then going through offensive line, corner, defensive line, obviously wide receiver, some of the big positions that Green Bay could target. And we wrap that up with defensive line today. We're going to go over both defensive ends and defensive tackles and who Green Bay could potentially come out of this free agent class with. We'll get to that in just a moment. Before we get there, of course, always appreciate any likes, subscriptions, comments, 5-star reviews. Those all help the channel a ton. If you want to also check out those Pack-A-Day Podcast YouTube memberships, those are also amazing. So make sure to do that. But we've got a couple pieces of news before we get into our main topic. The first of which is from Tom Silverstein of PackersNews.com. He reported that the Packers did not, in fact, approach Jaire Alexander or his agent with a opportunity to take a pay cut. Interesting. You would have thought sort of, and I talked about this the other day, that the logical progression here would have been, hey, is there a way that we can renegotiate your contract? And I think in what Tom Silverstein's reporting here is that the Packers knew Jaire and his agent would say no. So what was the point of going through that process? Which, awesome. I appreciate it. You don't need to go through unnecessary steps. You could take it, right? I guess you could say, like, in the form of due diligence or whatever. It sounds like they also didn't want to offend it. It also sounds like they didn't want to set a precedent of like, oh, the Packers are just going to go and ask for a pay cut from everyone. And also, it sounds like they didn't want to ask him to take a pay cut. Again, this is per Tom Silverstein, because they knew that it wasn't like necessarily Jaire's fault, that this has been an injury issue that's been causing this. And they don't want to go to him because it's been injuries and say, we want you to take a pay cut, because that's unfair. Now, the other connotation to this is, well, they're going to probably trade him or cut him, which is probably, in some capacity, maybe, depending on what he gets in the free agent market, potentially worse. Right. But either way, this is all to say that this continues to trend in a progression and progress in a way that, just Jaire is not going to come back, which, again, I think the writing's been very much on the wall. We've talked about it for months now, and it just continues to trend in that direction. And the fact that they didn't even go to him with a potential pay cut option just tells you that these sides are both ready to move on, and Jaire is not going to be a Green Bay Packer in 2025. Salary cap officially set at $279.2 million for 2025. So a great sum of money. It's going to help the Packers, but it's going to help every other team as well. And as I've said, you're going to see some money get thrown around in free agency that probably borders on ridiculous for some players that probably you usually wouldn't get that type of money, just because it's a poor free agent class with a expanding salary cap. And that's just going to lead to some very big deals for some players that probably, again, in most situations and scenarios, would not get monster contracts. Speaking of which, Trey Smith, the guard for the Chiefs, is officially off the market, at least from a free agency standpoint. Maybe you could still potentially trade for him. The Chiefs did decide to use the franchise tag on him. We've talked about how sort of just weak this free agency class is, but also that it's not top heavy. You could make an argument that if a free agent class, the top two targets are T. Higgins and Trey Smith, that's kind of all you need to know, right? Like if those are your headliners, it's not that great of a class. But now Trey Smith and T. Higgins aren't even available. They're both franchise tagged. So this already watered down, not great free agency class just got even worse because those two players are now on the franchise tag. So that's where we stand with potential free agents. And again, you add in the fact that you've got all this money for teams to spend, and even your two top of the line guys are off the market. Like, it's going to get funny. It's going to get very weird. Going to get very weird very fast. I'll put it that way. Speaking of Trey Smith, by the way, it doesn't affect the Packers. They were not going to go out and sign Trey Smith to a huge contract. That's just not in their DNA to go spend huge money on a guard. They also probably just don't need it. It doesn't exactly fit Matt LaFleur's scheme either. But what it does do is take him off the market for Chicago, who is probably very much interested in the Trey Smith market, and then potentially Minnesota, where there was some interest potentially there as well. So Trey Smith, the good news is, will not end up in the division, or if he does, it's going to take a draft pick plus a significant contract, which you mind a little bit less. Myles Garrett is not open to an extension with the Cleveland Browns. I still think it's going to be hard for Cleveland to trade him. but they're running out of options. They're basically going to get 2 years of Garrett if they play hardball. I guess they could franchise tag him after that. Maybe it's not the complete end of the world, but it certainly does not help for the Browns that he's not willing to renegotiate or extend or anything like that. That that could get messy, and that could lead to Myles Garrett being on the market. As we've talked about before, the Browns are in a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad cap situation, which makes it incredibly difficult to trade Myles Garrett. But there are ways to get it done. We'll see if Cleveland does that, or if they really play hardball and say, no, you're playing for Cleveland this year. That's another one that's going to be very interesting to watch, especially if you have any hope or inkling of hope that Myles Garrett could ultimately end up in Green Bay. Last but not least, the combine kicked off, at least the workout portions kicked off on Thursday. Jamar Stewart, one of the big winners, just tested out of this world, very much a Green Bay type, but is likely now going to be gone by pick 23. I never want to say that with any sort of definitiveness or like just, foregone conclusion, because these things can change relatively quick come draft time. But, based on his testing, I know he didn't have the most productivity in the world in college, but that's going to be a player that in all likelihood goes very early in this draft. I'd be surprised based on the testing and based on the prospect and the athlete if he does in fact last to pick 23. I know some people are happy about that because they say you don't want another project or a player that doesn't have the productivity from school. I get it. I understand it, but he is a heck of a prospect. Maybe it's a good thing he won't be there at 23. Maybe it's a bad thing. I'll let you jump to your own conclusions. We'll get to the scouting breakdown of him eventually, but he was one of the surefire winners of Thursday at the combine. And of course, we'll keep track of it and kind of go over some of the winners and losers, specifically probably you might hear it on the audio, from Jacob Morley, from Ross Uglum as he goes through some of the daily draft stuff. But I'll definitely touch base with it with Justice Mosqueda early next week and kind of go over some of the big winners as well. All right, let's get to our main topic for today, which is defensive line and specifically ends and tackles that Green Bay could target in free agency. In order to do so, it is very important, first of all, that again, we look at where this defensive line stands right now and specifically where they look in the future as well, if you look forward to 2026. So right now, defensive end, you've got Rashawn Gary, LVN, Kingsley Enagbare, Brenton Cox that are under contract, ready to play this year. Defensive tackle, Kenny Clark, Devontae Wyatt, Carl Brooks, and Colby Wooden. So you do have an 8-man rotation. Those are all mostly locked in. I think Colby Wooden does not necessarily earn the right to just automatically get a 53-man roster spot, right? Like he's probably going to have to earn it. Brenton Cox might still be in that realm, but I think everyone would expect that he probably makes it. So Gary, LVN, Enagbare, Cox, Clark, Wyatt, and Brooks, 7 players right there that are probably going to be on this team in some capacity. You might only have, room for 2 more, 3 more at the most. And that could include Colby Wooden as well. So you don't need a ton more from a depth standpoint here, but you could use an influx of talent and specifically pass rushing to add to this group. TJ Slayton is an unrestricted free agent. That's a decision that they'll have to make. If the price is right, I could see him back. But with this defensive tackle draft class being so incredibly strong, I think they'll probably let him test the market. Again, if he comes back for cheap, awesome. If not, I think they'll let the draft go. And then if he's still out there after and they didn't get the defensive tackles that they wanted, maybe they could revisit it at that time. But as of right now, not really expecting Slayton to be back unless it's a super cheap deal. As you look forward to 2026, Rashawn Gary still under contract next year, although if he doesn't perform the way that you would want, there are potential outs next year, but I still would very much expect Rashawn to be on the roster next year. LVN still on the roster next year. Brenton Cox will be a restricted free agent. If he plays anywhere near well, that'll be an easy decision for Green Bay. He should be there as well. Defensive tackle, much more interesting. Kingsley Enagbare will be an unrestricted free agent at end, but defensive tackle, we don't know what they're going to do with a 5th-year option and how they kind of go about that for Devontae Wyatt as of this point. So as of right now, he's set to be an unrestricted free agent next year. Kenny Clark is his contract you can get out of, so there's no guarantee he's on the team. As I talked about, Colby Wooden, is not even a lock to make the team this year. And then that leaves you really kind of with Carl Brooks. So this defensive tackle position could be a more position of need. Now, you could end up still with Brooks, Wooden, Clark, and Wyatt all on the roster next year too. So it just depends on how some of these things go over the course of the next year. But that's where the defensive line room stands both in 2025 and in 2026. There's a lot of defensive ends and defensive tackles that could be available in free agency. I think the one thing that we need to touch base on before we get into the specific players is this, like many other spots on the roster, is one of those positions where you don't just need guys. It's not a depth concern. You have players that can rotate in and can help you win football games. That's not the problem. It's not like you're in this barren wasteland of defensive ends and defensive tackles. Your defensive line is fine right now. It's not great, but it's fine. It's maybe even good. And if you get DeMarcus Covington, the new defensive line coach, to come in and he can maybe unlock a couple things, maybe it's even better than that. But they don't need specifically just like a rotational defensive end or a rotational defensive tackle. They can find that in the draft if they need it. All right. They can find another defensive end to rotate in. They can find another defensive tackle to maybe take TJ Slayton's spot. Those are fine things. But what this defensive line needs is a playmaker, is a difference maker, is a pass rusher. That's what you're looking for. So we can go through a lot of these defensive players and we'll go through them. But just remember, adding anyone on a contract that's just going to be another rotational guy that's okay, but maybe isn't going to be able to break down some of the best offensive linemen or is not going to be a massive value add, whether it's at defensive end or defensive tackle, it probably just doesn't move the needle. You'd probably rather give those snaps to Brenton Cox, Kingsley Enagbare, LVN to see if they can develop and take a next step. Probably rather give it to Colby Wooden and Carl Brooks and Devontae Wyatt to see if they can develop and take that next step. So you don't just need a free agent signing for the sake of a free agent signing. You need a legitimate guy who can be a difference maker for you. So it's going to be very top heavy with where Green Bay could potentially go here. So let's start with defensive end. We've talked about a lot of these key ones already. So if you want to check out the deep dives in some of these, they're out there. Khalil Mack, Josh Sweat, Chase Young, those deep dives are all out there for you, as is, the Myles Garrett and Max Crosby episode. We've talked about Oso Digizua, Milton Williams, Levi and Muzurike. All of those players we've done deep dives into. So if you want a greater deep dive into that, those are all available out there for you. But we'll start with Khalil Mack. Still think that this is a very good option for Green Bay. Yes, he just turned 34 years old. I get it. He's had 140 pressures over his last 2 seasons. Still a very good run defender. And as I've said a million times already this offseason, just go throw on the tape. I am not generally a proponent of signing 34-year-old anythings. It's just usually not going to end well. And maybe this won't. And if Goody decides like, hey, I think I'm just going to stay away because he's 34, not even necessarily mad at it. I think this is probably one where you're willing to maybe make a little bit more of an exception just because the dude looks 27 on tape. Like he looks closer to 24 than 34 when you throw the tape on. So I'd be willing to make an exception. And I also kind of think as you look at this free agency as a whole, right? We've talked about it. Finding these A+ blue chip players in this specific, free agency class is not exactly easy. And if you do find them, you're probably overpaying to a massive degree. So if you're going to sign somebody and it's going to be an overpay, maybe it's better to do a Khalil Mack on a 1 to 2 year deal where you're only caught up in that maybe overpay for 2 seasons, where you do have a very clear window that's open right now, rather than giving somebody a 4 or 5 year deal that's really going to maybe hurt you a little bit more because it's a bad contract for a longer period of time. Just one way of thinking about it. But Khalil Mack fits everything Green Bay needs. And he's going to be a stud. He's going to be a mentor. He fits perfectly with Rashawn Gary at the defensive end spots where they can really bookend each other. This is a move that makes a lot of sense for Green Bay. He should absolutely be on Green Bay's list. One of the issues is the Chargers are adamant that they want him to return. They're not going to franchise tag him or transition tag him. It does not seem. So that piece of it is out. Now the question will be, can they get a deal done with him before he reaches free agency? If he does, it's a non-starter, obviously, for Green Bay. He's off the market. If he doesn't, then all bets are off, and it doesn't really matter that the Chargers want him back because now he can negotiate with every team, and Green Bay should have their chance. So that is one that should be on that list. Josh Sweat's another. We've talked about this. The more and more that I think about it, the more and more that I think Josh Sweat could be one of those 1A targets for Green Bay. Loved his tape. I knew he was a good player. I've tracked him since college and really kind of kept an eye on him with the Eagles because he was one of those players I liked coming out of the draft. I knew he was good. I actually thought the tape was much better than even the PFF grade or even that I expected going into it. He's got a little bit of everything. He can rush the passer, speed, power, a variety of moves. Doesn't give up on plays. Good hustle player. He's got all the athleticism in the world. He explodes to the quarterback. I really liked him. Gets sucked inside on run plays a little bit too much, a little bit inconsistent. You don't want him dropping in coverage, which isn't an issue because he's going to be a 4-3 end in Green Bay anyway. I think this makes a lot of sense. 28 years old, tag team partner with Rashawn Gary would seem perfect. Like they should bookend each other very, very well. I like this a lot. That's another one that should be on the list. Then we're going to get to a lot that maybe don't make as much sense. And there's a couple more that maybe do, but Hassan Reddick to me is a no. Saw a pretty drastic decline. Now, the whole Jet situation was just bizarre. The trade, the holdout, all of it. Then he came back, did not play well. The season was basically over for the Jets by that time anyway. But this is more your prototypical speed pass rusher. And Goody has just literally said he's not interested in that type of player. So I would not expect it to be Hassan Reddick. Malcolm Kuntz is such an interesting case study. He tore it up at the end of 2023, had 52 pressures on only 344 pass rush snaps. So 344 pass rush snaps with 52 pressures, just an unbelievable rate. Here's Malcolm Kuntz's 4-year career so far. In 2021, he played a total of 48 snaps. In 2022, he played a total of 68 snaps. Then in 2023, in his breakout season, he still only played a total of 501 snaps, with the majority of those rushing the passer, 344. They didn't really play him on rundowns, but he had 52 pressures in those 501 snaps and again on 344 pass rush snaps. An unbelievable number. Then in 2024, it was out for the entire season with a torn ACL. So basically, didn't play, pass rush specialist with 501 snaps. That was phenomenal. And then torn ACL. I mean, the guy's what, 617 snaps? 617 snaps in his career? In his career, a 4-year career, 617 snaps. And he's coming off a torn ACL. I don't know what to do with that. Now, I think he's probably going to be a little bit more of that pass rusher, slightly undersized. He's 250-ish in that range, so it's not brutal. But I don't think it's going to be what Green Bay's specifically looking for. And I just think it might be a little bit too much of a gamble. We're not talking about a 1-year wonder. We're talking about a half-year wonder as a pass rusher only. And then he tore his ACL after that. I don't know what to do with it. I really don't. I don't think it's going to be Green Bay. He's an interesting player. But man, you would be a big gamble coming off the ACL and really only having a half of a season where he completely tore it up. I don't know what you do with that, but it sounds like he's going to get a big contract. Sounds like there's a good chance he stays with the Raiders. I don't think it'll be with Green Bay. Baron Browning, Green Bay had the opportunity to trade for last year. They didn't have any interest in doing it. I don't think they're going to have an interest again. Again, he doesn't move the needle all that much. You have that caliber of player already on your roster. 2 more that I think could make some sense. We've talked about Chase Young, 26 years old, 6'5", 264. The run defense has really fallen off a cliff, so that might be a problem for Goody, unless they believe that he can get back playing the way that he was earlier in his career. At least there is tape of him earlier in his career stopping the run at a much better level. But as of late, it has been a nightmare. It's just not the run defense that you would expect. I don't think it's not good. I'll just put it that way. It's not good. He's had injury issues. I do think he fits Green Bay's mold for what they like at the position and their timeline. As I mentioned, he's just turning 26 this year. 6'5", 264, really good player. Definitely feels like he maybe doesn't take it completely seriously, or maybe takes a play off here and there. I didn't think it was that bad on the tape, if I'm being honest, but it still exists a little bit. Doesn't quite ever live up to the expectations. Always leaves you wanting just a little bit more. Maybe. I'll put it as a maybe. I don't think it's super likely, but it's not completely out of the question either. And then you have maybe one of the under the radar ones. And this just feels like a Green Bay move all day, every day. Dayo Odeyingbo from the Indianapolis Colts, 6'6", 286. I mean, that's just Green Bay written all over it, right? 42 pressures in 2024 on 746 snaps, 439 pass rush snaps. 25 years old, had 12 sacks in 2023, and it's just loaded with untapped potential. Storyline here was likely going to be a first-round pick when he came out of the draft, had a major injury. Colts drafted him relatively earlier than most people were expecting him to go because of the major injury, because they knew he had this untapped potential. He's played 4 years in Indy. The first year was mostly a redshirt year, but he's played the 4 seasons in Indy, has had flashes. Like I said, 42 pressures this past year is fine. 12 sacks in 2023, but it wasn't on a ton of pressure. So usually you can't kind of continue those numbers, but it is very clear and obvious that there is a great deal of potential there. And he is still only 25 years old. So if they strike out on everything else, I could see Green Bay maybe taking a flyer on a very talented, but still slightly unproven 25-year-old defensive end who's had to battle some injury issues in his career and is still, again, probably in that untapped potential category, but really fun player. He fits Green Bay's mold. That's one to really keep an eye on that. Like, don't let it stun you if Green Bay goes in that direction. He's a good football player. I don't think he's the level of player that is going to completely move the needle for you in any one way. I think there's a good chance that if he signed like and was the next defensive end for Green Bay, that he would be the starter opposite Rashawn. I think he could, bump actually back LVN and Enigbari, etc. But I don't know that he's going to be the guy that you're like, that's why you're winning games, right? And you might have to pay him close to, 18, 20 mil a year still. I think he's going to get a big contract because of his age and his potential. So very interesting signing for some team. Maybe he stays with the Colts. Maybe he ends up with Green Bay. This would not stun me, by the way, just because of the height, weight, speed, the profile, what they look for in their defensive ends. Wouldn't shock me. It would be slightly underwhelming, and maybe depending on the contract, maybe a little bit disappointing. But he's a good football player, and there is, like I said, a lot of opportunity for Odeyingbo to become a much better pass rusher. It wouldn't be completely unlike the Zadarius Smith signing. Hopefully, it would pay off to that level if they signed him that way. But good player, just again a name that maybe is a little bit under the radar for a lot of people. The rest just don't make any sense. Azeez Ojulari, rotational piece at best, has not done great in New York. DeMarcus Lawrence, he's just a litany of injuries. Dante Fowler, maybe a cheap option. A little bit too Preston Smithy here, right, at this stage of his career. Green Bay moved on from that already. I don't think they're going to want another one of that. Chauncey Goldston, more of a rotational piece. Again, you have that. Matt Judon's a little bit interesting because he has that connection with DeMarcus Covington, but he's 33 years old in August. Now, he had 69 pressures in 2022 and 64 in 2021, then was injured in 2023, traded to Atlanta in 2024, looked awful in 2024 with Atlanta. If you can get him super cheap and reunite him with Covington, maybe it's worth a flyer, but I don't think that's what you're going to lean on to necessarily fix your problem unless he hops in a hot tub time machine and really becomes the player that he was a handful of seasons ago. Again, as a flyer, veteran, whatever. I just think somebody gives him more money than Green Bay would ever be interested in. But the only thing that's somewhat interesting there would be the reunion with DeMarcus Covington, where, he played some of his best football when Covington was there as coach. Dennis Gardeck's a player I really like, but he's coming off a torn ACL, Arizona Cardinal. Plus he's like 30 years old. Just doesn't make sense. Josh Uche was another player that they could have traded for, had no interest in doing so. Derek Barnett is a nice little veteran rotational piece that, if you needed that, it would be fine. But again, that's not what Green Bay needs here. They don't need a fourth or fifth defensive end, a veteran coming in. They can find that type of player in the draft, or even just, again, give those snaps to Brenton Cox and Enigbari and LVN at that point. Charles Omenihu, I've always liked. I think in this defense, yes, he can play some end, but you might have to use him a little bit more as a interior rusher in a 3 technique, and he's probably a bit redundant to Devontae Wyatt, Carl Brooks, Colby Wooden at that point. And then Marcus Davenport. I mean, Jaire Alexander plays more snaps than Marcus Davenport over the last 4 years. So guy, unfortunately, just cannot stay healthy. That's probably not the direction that you want to go in if you're Green Bay. Then, of course, you have the potential trade options, right? Myles Garrett, Max Crosby, Trey Hendrickson, Joey Bosa, trade or release if they end up getting released like a Joey Bosa. But Garrett, Crosby, Hendrickson, all the teams right now are saying that they're going to keep them. It doesn't seem like they're going to become available. Joey Bosa could get cut. These are the snaps that Joey Bosa's played over the last 3 seasons: 203, 320, 503. He's played almost 1,000, basically like 1,000 snaps over a 3-year period of time. So buyer beware in that situation. Jadeveon Clowney, there's been no rumors of him actually being available. Harold Landry is not what Green Bay is looking for based on Goody's definition the other day. A little bit more of a pass rusher for Landry. He's not a great run defender. He runs hot and cold. Just not what I see Green Bay being interested in. Bradley Chubb missed all of last year with an ACL, a meniscus, and a patellar tendon. Don't think that's going to be the move. Bryce Huff was a kind of a bust last year in Philly, just was not able to kind of put it together. And he's more of that pass rush type. And Sam Hubbard for the Bengals has completely lost a step. So I just don't necessarily see any of those. The ones that we talked about, Khalil Mack, Josh Sweat, Dayo Odeyingbo, someday I'll get that one right. Usually those are the ones, by the way, like Osa Digizua, Levi Nwuzurike. That's what they should do. Just sign Dayo Odeyingbo, Levi Nwuzurike, and Osa Digizua. Just get the full alphabet on the defensive line. That would be a hell of a free agent class, and you've really just covered all the consonants and the vowels at that point in time. But Azeez Ojulari, another one. Like you could, if you were like a exhibition team or like a franchise team, like a new franchise. Yeah, you know what I mean. If you were a new franchise and you could put this together, you could build quite the alphabet on that defensive line. I digress. Defensive tackles, we've gone over a lot of these. Again, Milton Williams, Osa Digizua, Levi Nwuzurike. Osa, he's already working on a contract with Dallas. I think he probably ends up back there, even if he doesn't. Undersized, 3 technique, not a great run defender. Don't think that's the direction Green Bay goes in. Levi Nwuzurike, we've talked about 6'3", 304. He's 300 plus pounds, solid against the run, legit nice piece. He can rush the passer a little bit, only 27 in March. The issue is he's had back injuries and he's a little bit redundant with Devontae Wyatt. It's kind of like what they already have in hand with Devontae. So I like him. I think he'd be a good pickup. Just not sure Green Bay goes in that direction. Milton Williams, man, I love Milton Williams. Goody just talked about like how he doesn't want these rotational pieces. Milton Williams is a terrible run defender. He's an unbelievable pass rusher. So you really have to reconcile that from a Packers standpoint. Goody just talked about not wanting those type of players. The only thing that I could see here is maybe as a defensive end, because he can move around. Maybe as defensive end, he could have enough value as a run defender. As a defensive tackle, he does not. But maybe as a defensive end, being a little bit bigger in that scenario, he could. And maybe they could find a way to utilize him that way. But I'm more okay with this. Like, just go get a dominant pass rusher on the interior. He's going to pay off and pay dividends for you. I just don't necessarily see Goody going in that direction. And then you've got rotational pieces. BJ Hill is 30 in April, 6'3", 311, really solid piece inside with a defensive tackle draft that's so deep. It just doesn't make a ton of sense to go after and pay big contracts to players like this. I love Calais Campbell, 82.3 grade in 616 snaps at age 38 this past year. He's an absolute freak. He's a machine. He had 39 pressures, which is 5 more than Kenny Clark had. Was an 85.9 run defense grade. And just go watch the tape. He's still an absolute freak. Uses his length so incredibly well, but I just don't see Green Bay going for a 39-year-old defensive tackle. Jerron Reed, former Packer rotational piece, probably not. Same thing with Poona Ford, Tershawn Wharton. Those, I think, are just, again, nice rotational pieces. I think they just re-signed TJ Slayton in those scenarios. And then last but not least is Javon Hargrave, who is going to get released by the 49ers. This is a interesting one where he's coming off a torn triceps, but his 3 seasons prior to last year, his pressures were 63, 66, and 64. He's been a pressure machine. He's one of the best pass rushing defensive tackles from 2021 to 2023. He's 32 years old, only played 104 snaps last year before the injury. He's 6'2", 305, so a little bit undersized, but he holds up okay against the run as well. He could be a flyer type at defensive tackle to maybe help that pass rush if he can get back in form, but 32 coming off a pec injury, it's a little bit of a tough sell. And again, he's a little bit more of that 3 technique, which again, maybe Green Bay's okay with that, but they'd have to kind of get through that and see if that would be something that they'd be interested in at this point in time with the players that they already have along their defensive line. Jonathan Allen, the only other one that's a potential cut candidate right now. He's on the trade block. I think he ultimately gets released. Green Bay could look at him, 30 years old. If cut, I don't think they would trade for him. He's got some ability to rush the passer and stop the run, but the last 2 years, he's really not played as well. There's been a decline there, and I don't think that move makes sense for Green Bay. So if you look at defensive end and defensive tackle in totality of who ultimately makes sense here, Khalil Mack to me does, Josh Sweat, maybe Chase Young, maybe Dio Odeyingbo. That's probably it from an edge rusher standpoint. And then maybe Levi Nwuzurike and maybe Milton Williams at defensive tackle. I think those are the ones you're probably looking at. Now, if Myles Garrett, Max Crosby, Trey Hendrickson, one of those players become available via trade, should Goody be looking at it? Yes, absolutely. But I think if you had to have me narrow it, I think if Green Bay is going to look at anyone in this free agent class, Mack, Sweat, Chase Young, Odeyingbo, Nwuzurike, and Milton Williams would be the ones that would most clearly come to mind. So what say you? Who should they sign? Who do you want them to go after? You know, are you okay with 34-year-old Khalil Mack? Are you okay with giving 20, 21, 22 million a year to Josh Sweat, despite maybe not being that elite player? Chase Young, maybe not the guy that, you know, he was expected to be. He's been what, 3 teams in 4 years or whatever it's been, four teams. The Commanders, the 49ers, the Saints. This would be his 4th team in 3 years. So yeah, like he's been bounced around a little bit. Odeyingbo, talented, young, but has never really all put it together. Has had some injury concerns. And Nwuzurike, again, a little bit redundant to Devontae Wyatt. Milton Williams sucks against the run. So who are you looking for? And who should Green Bay go and sign? If they're going to spend money on one of these guys, who do you hope it is? To me, I think Josh Sweat makes a lot of sense. I love Khalil Mack. I would go Khalil Mack if I were Green Bay. I think that one makes the most sense to me. But Sweat does as well. And maybe one of the other guys could be somebody that fits, and Goody feels better about, somebody like a Milton Williams against the run than I do. And that could probably solve that problem. I love Milton Williams. I'd be all for it. So again, Max, Sweat, Young, Odangbo, and Wuzurike, and Milton Williams, the 6 that I think could be on Green Bay's radar as they look for a premium defensive end or defensive tackle in this free agent class. That is going to do it for me today. Thank you so much for joining me. I always appreciate you guys a ton. Shout out to our All-Pro and Hall of Fame members, Mo Saden, Minnesotan, PJ Wynn, John Wild, Brandon Paletta, Jennifer Wright, Boom Handle, Donna Lee, Lori Lord, Baby QB, David McCluskey, Donald Decker, Alex Wong, Arnaldo Espinoza, Peter Ataka, Jay Zimmerman, B. Brown, Puerto Rican Packer, Dan Guestford, Step Keat, Dylan Pat Scott, Bobby Santoro, SoCal Pack, Chris Rager, Izzy Roberts, Ian Ewing, Razul Douglas Time, and Jay Koner. I'll see you guys tomorrow. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.